back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. James, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. I guess maybe it's about, what, 2 years since you were last on?
It's been a while, but it's a pleasure to be here chatting with you about boredom again.
I know, boredom, a subject that everyone's like, how can you find that interesting? But since your first episode on, you really kind of changed my perspective on what it means to be bored. But could you please, for the maybe new listeners out there, could you please reintroduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, my name's James Danckert. I'm a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And for about the last 10 or 15 years, I've studied boredom.
Now, what is the importance of boredom in our lives?
Boredom, the way we characterize it is as a self-regulatory signal. It tells you something. So the importance of it is in its function, in what it does for you. And boredom tells you that whatever you're doing right now isn't meaningful or engaging in some really important way to you. So you need to do something else. It's very different than apathy. So it's not the couch potato image that some people have in their minds when they think about boredom. It's a motivational state. When you're bored, you want to be doing something that's meaningful and purposeful to you. The frustration and the conundrum of boredom is that in that moment, you just don't know what's going to work. And that's why the most common thing that we find associated with boredom are feelings of restlessness and agitation, because you want that engagement, but you can't quite manage to get it.
Do you think that we understand, I guess, or have a healthy relationship with boredom? I mean, it seems like a lot of people don't want to be bored, but as you look deeper into what boredom is, I mean, I could, I guess, relate it to money spending. How many people are buying things, games, stuff they don't need, just wastefully spending money away because they are trying to get over their boredom? And then also, how many people are trying to diagnose or find a solution to boredom? And then it gets linked into something like depression. Maybe you're just depressed. That's why everything's kind of just meaningless to you. And it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in what you're saying there. There's certainly lots of data showing that the consumatory behaviors are associated with boredom, anywhere from eating to shopping, as you mentioned, right? So there's some recent work showing that, particularly during the pandemic, I think that people engaged in online shopping more simply out of boredom. They weren't really thinking about what they wanted, what they needed, but just doing something to fill the void that was evident to them because of being bored. And then there's some great work from a guy in Ireland, Andrew Moynihan and Eric Igu and their colleagues, showing that people will eat and overeat when they're bored. And also they have at least one study that shows that if you give people options of what to eat when they're bored, they typically go for the high sugar, sort of less healthy foods than the healthy foods that you put in front of them. So not only do you sort of mindlessly eat when you're bored, but you might not make good choices about what to eat. And then the other one that you didn't really sort of touch on is, of course, turning to social media, like that, just to fill your mind. Each of these things sort of occupy your mind. And there's lots of other stuff that's been associated with being prone to boredom, like people engaging in problem gambling and problematic use of drugs and alcohol. Each of these kinds of things, they really function in the same sort of way. They help you occupy your mind when you're bored, but they don't really satisfy that other thing that boredom is calling for, which is to do something kind of meaningful and that matters to you, right? So at the end of your episode of eating a packet of M&Ms or an hour on a slot machine, sure, you weren't bored during that time because you occupied yourself. But when you finish doing whatever that activity is, what boredom was telling you is still there. It's telling you to find something meaningful to do. So all of those kinds of behaviors are problematic because they're not really effective solutions to boredom.
There's a bunch of industries out there, like the happiness industry, and a bunch that literally are like companies trying to profit off of certain emotions, whether it's just building things that help you get there, even motivational books you could bring up. But is there something like that for boredom? Being able to try and focus it or trying to do something. Obviously, it seems like a lot of our society is about avoiding it, but Hobby Lobbies were like an important, integral part of the world back in the day. Like, just like, hey, these are all these hobbies, things you can do to keep your mind busy or feel like you're doing something. And we don't really have a whole lot of that. It seems like now it's like you mentioned with social media, it's just mindlessly scrolling. You're still technically bored. I just don't think you're cognizant of what you're actually doing.
I would agree that you're probably still not really fully engaged, and whether or not you notice or recognize that as boredom is another thing. But you're not as effectively engaged as you could be. As a quick aside, with the hobby sort of thing, as a philosopher, I can't remember the name now of this person that in the 20th century, I said, I don't have hobbies, and I despise the notion of hobbies, and you know, one should never talk about hobbies. What he was saying is, yeah, by all means, have things that you do, whether or not it's, you know, stamp collecting or you know, making model trains or whatever it is that you and I would call a hobby, but engage with it fully, right? If it matters to you, if it's meaningful to you, hobby tends to be sort of a dismissive way of talking about it. So don't be dismissive about the things that you do. You know, fully commit to that model train set, commit to the stamp collecting, whatever the hobby is, commit to the jujitsu that you do on the weekends, whatever it is, really fully commit to it. And then it's no longer a hobby, it's a meaningful activity that you're doing. It's a bit of a semantic sort of issue, but I think it's kind of interesting nonetheless. You've raised this issue of like, is there anything like a self-help kind of notion for boredom? Um, there are certainly people, and this is the flip side of the negative things that I talked about earlier about boredom, but there are some people who suggest that you should lean into your boredom. You should embrace your boredom. The big thing that people want to talk about there is that boredom could lead to creativity. And I bristle at that because I think the logic is just a little bit skewed. Creativity is a wonderful way to eliminate, to get out of your boredom episode, right? But you can't expect that boredom will somehow make you creative. So creativity is a complex capacity that humans have, and it's one that you need to train and you need to practice, right? If we think about someone like, you know, Jimi Hendrix, a guitar virtuoso, he didn't just sort of get bored and then somehow become amazing on guitar. He played the thing 8 hours a day, right? And tried new things. So boredom won't make you creative. And for that reason, I don't think people should necessarily lean into it. But if you have creative outlets, then sure, go for it. There isn't, as far as I know, a lot of this kind of self-help industry type stuff saying, you know, how to deal with your boredom. I get asked it a lot, and we don't have data, because what we would need from psychological experiments, we'd need intervention studies. We'd need to make people bored and then give them some sort of skill to try and get out of it. And as far as I know, we haven't really done that yet. There's a handful of work in high school students where they're kind of captive, right? They have to stay in class all day, that suggests that the best way to cope with boredom in a classroom is to reframe what you're doing, to think about it differently and think about it in a way that makes whatever you're doing, the math class that you're doing that you're bored by, makes that class more interesting to you and therefore more engaging and less boring. But that's really all that we have in terms of what kind of strategies you might want to employ to get out of your boredom. I think it's ripe though. Like you suggest, the way you talked about this self-help industry and, you know, making money off of how to advise people to cope with their emotions. I think boredom is probably ripe for it. I think you can expect to see a number of books come out in the next couple of years saying this is how to cope with your boredom.
Is there a correlation, or have you been able to find any areas where there's certain, not, I wouldn't say societal activities, but certain things that we would call probably very important? I'll use the education system as an example, where there's just more proneness to boredom, where we can try and find factors of why that's happening. Because I feel like if you're doing a study about, like, hey, we're going to put you in this room, we need to study boredom, it's just a blank wall, that's it, you're just going to sit there. I still feel like you're not going to get boredom out of this person because they're knowing that they're participating in a study where you're putting them in a room. For me, I'd still be antsy, like, oh, I'm part of a study right now. This is all a test, you know? It's, but for a school system, something where you're teaching math, reading, it kind of depends on the person, probably depending on the subject. History was always my strong suit, so I always paid attention, had a lot of fun in that. But math class was boredom at its finest. I'm wondering if there's ways we can try and find out what the qualities are and then be able to target those to make it more engaging. Because then eventually you'll have a lot more kids paying attention in school when they're less bored if we can eliminate the factors that are causing that boredom.
Yeah, so we do know a lot about what factors are prominent drivers of boredom, and school is a really good example of some of the most prominent factors. So one is constraint, right? If you feel like you're having to do something rather than wanting to do something, then you're more likely to be bored in that have to situation rather than the want to. And that just gets to what we'd call intrinsic motivation. So you talk about history versus math for yourself. You found that engaging, so you're intrinsically motivated to listen. You're like, oh, this stuff's really cool. I'm going to pay attention here, right? Whereas the math stuff you were not intrinsically motivated by. And you might have had your parents saying, as I know I have to my kids, it's like, You just got to play the game, do the best you can, get the score you can so that you can have, options in your future. But that's extrinsic motivation, right? I'm doing the math so that I can get a grade, so that I can maybe get to college or university and whatever else. So that's this external kind of thing pushing you to do it, whereas focusing in history for you was an internally generated motivation. And that just is much more effective at keeping you engaged and not bored. So constraint's a big one. Monotony is the next biggest one. I mean, perhaps even bigger than constraint. So any time that something is repetitive and not really changing from moment to moment, that can be really challenging to avoid boredom. But we also know that from things like assembly line work, which is repetitive and monotonous and the same hour after hour, that many of the people working on those assembly lines can cope without being bored. And they do that in various ways that, again, engage this kind of reframing of the situation. So if you are working on an assembly line and you keep saying to yourself, well, look, I'm going to try and beat my personal best from the last hour. I got 11 widgets through last hour. I'm going to try and get 12. Maybe you don't succeed and you don't get 12 this time, but you were motivated the whole time and so not bored. And all of that too, the constraint stuff I was just talking about brings up a really key part of boredom that I think we can recognize in various situations, whether it's education or work or elsewhere. And that is this notion of agency. We want to feel like we're the masters of our own domains, that we're the authors of our own lives, right? That we're choosing what we're doing, right? What we do next is something that we decided we wanted to do. We decided how we were going to go about it, and we decided why it was important and why it mattered. That makes us feel like we're being, effective agents in the world. We're acting effectively in and on the world. When you're bored, you're not. You're not very effective as an agent. And so I think those three things are probably the major drivers. Constraint, so having to do stuff you don't want to have to do. Monotony, things just not changing. And the feeling that you lack some sense of agency, that you're not the person in control of choosing what to do.
I know a lot on our first episode, we talked a lot about our environment being some influential factors, but does anything happen to do with sound as well too? Like certain noises or certain stimulus or reactionary, not just visual. I'm sure if you put a person in a room with a bunch of interesting murals on the wall, their mind can just wander with it and that might keep away some boredom. But I was wondering if there were sound qualities, like certain areas, like if it's just dead silence. A lot of people like that if they're a writer or something like that, but then also a lot of people find that to be more engaging when it comes to reaching boredom faster.
Well, there's a ton of things there. I mean, we don't really have a lot of good studies looking at what auditory factors, what sound factors might play into creating boredom. But you touch on a lot of other things that I think are really interesting. One is that, yeah, there's a lot of individual differences here. So I talk about monotony, constrained agency. These things aren't going to operate the same way for each of us. Some of us don't need the same sense of agency that others do. Some of us can cope better with monotony more than others. And so individual differences are huge. The other thing you touched on that, I can say about sound in particular is that humans and I would say other species of animals, mammals and birds, we need stimulation. That is, I don't mean stimulation as in you need something exciting. What I mean by stimulation is you need incoming information. And again, this is about interacting with the world around you, acting in and on that world. So this goes back to sort of work in the 50s on sensory deprivation, which has a really interesting kind of history. A chunk of this started because various intelligence agencies from the British, the Americans, and the Canadians were concerned about prisoners of war coming back from Korea with espousing communist ideologies. They'd been housed in a prisoner of war camp, and they'd been listening to all of this communist ideology, and they came back sort of espousing that. And so the intelligence agencies wanted to know how did their change of ideology happen? And one suggestion was, well, when you're in that prison, you're deprived of a lot of sensory input, and that deprivation of sensory input might make you open to new ideas or different ideas, right? So this started then in the 50s, these sensory deprivation experiments. The one that everybody sort of knows about from the movie Altered States, I guess, is you're lying in a tank of salt water so that you're floating and you've got no real sensations of touch or movement, and then you close the lid and you've got no sight and you've got no sound. And what happens when you do that to people is they start having some very weird experiences, right? So they start having hallucinations and this kind of thing. There's other forms of this kind of experiments that are not quite as dramatic as that. And when you isolate people and you reduce the amount of stimulation they're getting, the first thing they do is they get sleepy, even if you did that in the middle of the day and they weren't tired to begin with. So they'll have a little bit of a nap. And it's almost as if the brain is just saying, there's not enough happening in the world right now. Let's just shut down for a bit, right? But then they wake up and the world is still not changing and there's still not stimulation. And they'll start to get bored, and boredom becomes quite uncomfortable in that situation because you can't do anything about it. And ultimately, then after that, people will get they will have things like hallucinatory experiences, and they'll also have sort of dysregulation of emotions. They'll start to get agitated and angry. And a lot of that work then stopped in the 60s or 70s. It became blamed for the progenitor of various torture techniques that you can imagine. And whether or not that connection is true or not is not something I can sort of speak to. But what it says, if we circle back to sound, is there's something about sound and boredom. There's something about stimulation, about sensory stimulation. When we walk through this world, we are constantly bombarded with sensory stimuli. And it's not just vision, it's sound, it's vision, it's the sense of our body position in space, what we call proprioception, it's touch, it's smells, all sorts of stuff is happening to us every single millisecond of every day. If you remove that, or if you make that stimulation uniform, you make it monotonous, then yeah, boredom will happen very, very quickly. And you've talked briefly about, you could put people in a room with nothing there. Well, those experiments have been done, right? So Timothy Wilson first did it in 2014, and then others have followed up and replicated the work. If you put someone in a blank room with nothing to do but their thoughts for about 15 minutes, most sort of 1/3 of the people he tested don't really have a problem with it. They think, it's all right, this is just some downtime. 1/3 are kind of ambivalent. They don't like it or dislike it. And then the other third of the people in his experiments really hated it. They got quite bored and agitated and didn't like the experience. But it was their final experiment that was the one that was most important for boredom, I think, and this notion of sensory stimulation and the need for sensory stimulation. So in their final experiment, they had people in a room for 15 minutes with nothing but their thoughts, or you could self-administer an electric shock. And so a really high percentage of people self-administered this electric shock. And one guy shocked himself 196 times in 15 minutes. That's going well beyond curiosity. That's someone who really desperately needed that sensory stimulation. And really interestingly too, I know I've gone on a bit with this answer, but there's a study by Iwata and colleagues that showed that mice do the same thing. So if you put mice in a room and there's nothing for the mouse to do, but poke his hole through a nose and get a puff of air, and mice don't like that. It's aversive. They really don't like that stimulus. If you put mice in a room with nothing but that aversive stimulus, they will go to it. And in fact, in their studies, some of the mice engaged in behavior that looked like they were addicted to it. And so they went to it more and more over time. And so it's not a unique thing to humans that we need this sensory stimulation, and that one of the consequences of removing that sensory stimulation is boredom.
Is that a societal thing, like that we just evolved as people to have this craving or this need for always a capacity to want to do something? Or is that just like there's things about our brain? I mean, I could ask you this, but how much have you learned more about the human mind or have a different perspective on the human mind just on the basis of your research with boredom? Because it seems like it affects a lot. You mentioned negative decisions when it comes to like if you're choosing foods, it can cause you to maybe reach for the high sugary one, but also decision making, I mean, risk, all these factors that are heavily researched could be influenced from boredom. I mean, sometimes they can make good decisions, sometimes you can make bad decisions out of being bored. But overall, it just seems like our body has always found a way, or our brain has always found a way to try and, I don't know, it does stuff that you wouldn't expect it to. Like if it's cold out, it's going to keep all the heat towards your organs. That's why your fingertips and your toes will get a little bit colder. That's something that your body does naturally on its own. It's preserving it. It's doing things you're not even really perceiving, at least cognitively. It's just kind of happening. Boredom's the same thing. I mean, it's boredom is something that it happens, but then your body goes, let's take a nap, or hey, let's do this, or does this, or your mind starts to wander, you start to daydream. All these other factors start being influenced.
Yeah, so what you're talking about there is homeostasis. So when it's cold outside, your energy stores retreat to protect your organs. When it's hot, you sweat to again try and maintain the internal body temperature that's conducive to life, right? I would suggest that analogy is a very apt analogy for boredom, and that we would talk not just about homeostasis, but cognitive homeostasis or neural homeostasis. That is that there's an optimal way of engaging with the world. And when you're bored, it's saying you're not in that optimal zone. You need to do something to get back in that optimal zone. And like the temperature analogy, you've got extreme heat or extreme cold. And so you want to be somewhere in between those. So with boredom, I think that when you've got, extreme monotony and nothing much is happening, then you're bored. And so you need to get back up to a optimal engagement zone, a Goldilocks zone, if you like. But also when there's too much happening, when there's a ton of information that's bombarding you, then you can't make sense of it. Then you're also likely to get bored and need to come back down into that optimal Goldilocks zone. And Aaron Westgate and Tim Wilson did a study of this kind that showed exactly that. So they had people do what was essentially an air traffic control task. So you were looking at a radar screen, planes would go across the radar, and they could make the task more or less difficult. And so when they made it really super easy, so your task was to just make sure planes didn't crash into one another. So if one plane is coming slowly across the screen, it's super easy and you're bored. If 10 planes are coming across and they're coming at various speeds and it becomes really difficult, you also reported being more bored. There was an optimal zone of that air traffic control task that you wanted to be in order to not be bored. And so that is very much a homeostatic mechanism, I think. And I think that boredom is probably not the only signal that we have that we're outside of some optimal engagement zone. So anxiety works in that way as well. But I think boredom is an important signal and one that we probably haven't paid as much attention to in research until the last 5 or 10 years that we could have. And so what have I learned about the human mind? I think that we have large-scale neural networks in the brain that are important for a variety of different sorts of tasks. But ultimately, what we need is to coordinate those networks for optimal engagement, right? So that's a fairly high-level need that the organism has. I think you sort of slightly touched on this in the wording that you used when you asked this question of like this need for stimulation. This, is it a societal sort of thing? I think it's a biological thing, and that's the homeostatic analogy that you're making, that we really need optimal engagement of these resources that we have inside our head. The societal part to it is a response that we might have made to that, and it's either, from the outside in or from the other direction. And from the outside in, it is this creation of things like social media platforms and news platforms that are constantly shoving information in our face. The inside out, the reverse reaction to that or way of dealing with that is how we cope with that barrage of information, right? Do we keep going to the social media, keep going to our phones obsessively, or do we be more agentic and choose when we go to these things and choose how much time we spend on them and engage with the world in other ways so that we're managing how much time we're on that sort of information highway?
You mentioned biological, but do you think it's something that we're just born with, or do you think it's something that we develop from early childhood? Because if you compare, let's say, 1,000 years ago, I don't know how bored they were 1,000 years ago, but they didn't have all the capacity and technology that we have today to be able to do whatever we want every 5 minutes, which I think that has changed drastically. I would like to see a study done between people of today and then people of 1,000 years ago. But also, what about people in different career situations? Apparently, not everybody's running off the same base level of boredom. It doesn't take much to keep me entertained, but there are some people like adrenaline junkies and people that are like fighter pilots where they have to either be going so fast and so powerful in the air where their basically skin is being dragged off their bones because that's their thrill seek. That's what they want to do for a living. I mean, people want to be pilots for that specific reason, but it's not the same base level, me compared to anybody that wants to go into high risk job scenarios.
There are lots of different base levels, as you sort of say, and the extent to which people are thrill seekers. Again, this just comes down to individual differences in that need. But the first question you were asking was, are we born with it, or and comparing people 1,000 years ago? So I do think it is something that's inherent to the system. The system that I'm talking about here, the biological system of your brain, your central nervous system, and the resources it has, that's inherent to our makeup. That's we've evolved over thousands and tens of thousands of years to be like this. The story I tell on that front is based on the octopus. And so The octopus is an extraordinary animal. It only has two hard parts. It has a beak, and to some extent, its eyes are hard. The rest of it's gelatinous, very, very soft and malleable sort of body frame and body plan, right? And it has, and it can do extraordinary things. It can change the texture of its skin, can change the color of its skin. Its camouflage abilities are unparalleled, I think. And it has an interesting central nervous system as well. It kind of does have a central brain, but it also has these distributed brains in each of its tentacles. So you can cut a tentacle off an octopus, and for some period of time, that tentacle will act in purposeful ways. It'll wiggle around to try and distract a predator that presumably caused the thing to be amputated in the first place. And it has been shown in labs too that a severed tentacle will act as though to bring food back to a phantom mouth that's not there, right? So the tentacle will operate in purposeful ways, even though it's cut free from the rest of the body. So the thing about the octopus then is that it's an extraordinary body plan. It's very, very complex. You and I have degrees of freedom of what we can do with our body, like the joints in your hands, the joints in your skeleton. You know, there's only certain ways you can move those joints, whereas there's a ton of freedom for the octopus. He can move his tentacles in any kind of way that he likes, right? So it develops then over the course of evolution a sophisticated neural plan or a neural system to control that body plan, right? But then for each individual over development, you're asking about, are we born with this or does something evolve, for each individual's lifespan? For each individual octopus, as they're toddlers, let's say, they need to learn how to control that complex body plan. But once you've learned how to control that complex body plan, now you have leftover neural resources, because if you think about infant humans or any other kind of species, they pretty much use their entire brain trying to learn to do simple things like reaching out and grasping objects and so on, right? But by the time they're 10 or 12 years old, they've perfected all of that. So they don't need to use their whole brain to reach out and pick up a cup anymore. They can just use a small part of their brain. But because of that, because they've evolved this, because they've developed in their individual's lifespan this capacity to sophisticated control of their movements, now they've got leftover neural resources. And you have to do something with those leftover neural resources. This is why I think you see in many species play behavior, because they're using up these neural resources that they otherwise don't need to use right now. And boredom is a signal that you've got unspent resources. You need to use them, right? And so all of that story about the convoluted story about the octopus is to say, I think it's inherent to the system. We have evolved that system over tens of thousands of years, and then in each individual, you need to develop the capacity to control your body. Once you can control your body, you now have leftover resources and you need to use them in some kind of way. The societal stuff is that's the difference. You want to compare people 1,000 years ago to people now. We do know from studies from Sam Perrone and Elizabeth Waybright that boredom is on the rise, and particularly in teenagers. Why that is still a question for more research, but it does seem like it's slightly rising. I don't like the knee-jerk reaction of just blaming new technology, because I think that runs the risk of denigrating what new technology does for us in a positive way. You and I are speaking on Zoom right now. You know, how do we do this podcast if that doesn't exist? So, yes, there's a ton more technology, a ton more information, but I think the challenge is essentially the same. And the challenge is, what are you going to do with those surplus neural resources? When you've mastered your body plan, now you've got to put those resources to good use somehow. And boredom is a signal that you're not doing that.
Why does it get treated as like something that needs to be treated, boredom? Like we have to find a way to get either over this, and sometimes people can link it to depression. If you look up things about boredom, if you just type in how to not be bored or why am I being bored, and it's the same thing with taking naps too. I mean, maybe you just need a nap because you're tired, but then a lot of things get linked into like maybe you're depressed or maybe there's something else going on. And I don't think we should be examining like it needs to be necessarily treated. I think we need to look at ways of like, what are we doing, and is it okay right now to not do something? We live in a society that is you have to feel like you're doing something every 5 minutes or something like that, or you just feel like you're not doing anything at all. So it's interesting to think about. So I'm wondering why do you think we treat boredom as this thing that needs to be treated rather than a factor of just letting it be?
And the quick answer to that is because it feels bad, right? So
it feels like nothing, like the void. That's what it feels like.
Well, but I would suggest that, that the void feels bad because we do want to be engaging with the world. I take your point though that that can lead to a kind of response that says I must account for every second of my day in some kind of productive way, and then that productive way might be sort of determined by society's standards and goals, which might not match with my own, right? And so I agree with that. I think we shouldn't necessarily impose some kind of pressured response to boredom that you must be doing something every second of every moment of every day. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I also think I agree that I don't see boredom as a thing that needs to be treated. I think it's something that we need to learn to respond to as well as we can. There's a ton of people out there who say that only boring people get bored. It's a very moral, sort of moralistic kind of moralizing judgment. But what they're saying, I think, is that for them, when they get bored, they might not even notice it because they respond to it really quickly and really effectively. And so that's perhaps the thing that we can learn from those people is, okay, what is it that you do in those down moments that means that for you, you don't get bored? Maybe I can learn something from you and apply it in my own life. But I also think it's perfectly reasonable when you're in a boredom episode to say, all right, I don't need to do something right now. I can actually just sit and reflect for a little while and relax. All of that to say that, this is just finding the best response for you to being bored as opposed to treating it. If it serves a purpose, if boredom is functional, then there is no treating it. Like you can't get rid of it. It's going to be a part of everybody's life for the bulk of your life. So you don't get rid of it. You just learn how to respond to it. You also mentioned that boredom is often associated with depression, and we've known that for at least 40 years now, that boredom and depression are highly correlated. What we don't know is the chicken and egg. Do bored people get depressed, or do depressed people find everything boring? And this is a really interesting question to ask, and one that people are looking into, but we don't have a very good causal explanation for that relationship just yet.
Has there been an area that you've been particularly interested in when it comes to the subject of boredom? Like maybe an area that hasn't been studied, um, or maybe an area that has been covered that you just find that you get stuck on?
Well, the one area that I'm interested in doing something about, and I keep getting stuck on myself, not really knowing how to progress, is relates to the last thing that you were saying about, not occupying every moment of time with something, right? I think we need downtimes. We need refractory periods, right? So we're goal-driven animals. We pursue goals. We have things that we want to achieve. We set about achieving them. And then the thing about achieving a goal is that at the end of that, you have to say, well, what now? Now I have to have another goal, right? Um, and this is sort of why the Buddhists suggest that desire is a negative thing, because when you desire something and you get it, then you just have a new desire that you have to go on that's never ending, right? Um, but I disagree with the Buddhists. I think it's good to have goals and good to have desires, but we need to recognize that, again, this will be an individual difference. Some people can just leap from one goal to the next without any, even taking a breath in between. But most of us, I think, need some refractory period, some downtime. And I think people who are prone to boredom don't deal well with that downtime because they're sitting in that, what you call the void, and saying, what am I going to do now? What am I going to do now? Oh, this is boring. I should be doing something. What am I doing? Why aren't I doing something? I need to do something. What am I going to do? So finding, just trying to characterize what I'm talking about as a refractory period or downtime, and then trying to understand what factors make that pleasant or unpleasant for different people. I think that's something that hasn't really been done and that I'd be interested in trying to do.
Do you think like when it comes to like meditation and more of things that not necessarily accomplish what people would call doing something, it more does something inner inside yourself compared to what a lot of people want to examine when they're looking at accomplishments. They want to examine like money or other influential factors that are society things where you can, you can point to it. You got a nice car. But for people that want to meditate all day and either want to do yoga or just do something where they're achieving something more on the inner side, which do you feel like is a better capacity for trying to at least equip or deal with boredom? You think it has to be the ones where it has to be accomplishing something compared to like, I don't know, getting a nice car, getting a raise, doing something, going out, spending money, going to amusement park, or compared to just being able to sit and be and revel in that empty space and trying to turn it into actually something that you look forward to because you're progressing inside.
I think all of these things in human experience is that there ought to be some kind of balance. I mean, the things that you were describing that are a consumerist society, I would probably, on a personal level, I think we have been convinced to be consumers, and I think it's bad for the planet. It's bad for us as individuals, and so striving just so you can have stuff doesn't make much sense to me. But
Capitalism.
yeah, but I mean, I should also sort of own up to that's a sort of position of privilege, right? Like I have enough stuff, so I don't want more stuff, right? There's a lot of people out there that don't have a lot of stuff. And so, setting a goal of having something that's better than what you currently have is not necessarily a bad thing. Um, so, I'm not fond of consumerism and that kind of capitalistic approach. I don't think it brings meaning to your life. I think that it's kind of hollow. Um, on the flip side of things, like focusing on your inner life and meditation, I don't do that myself, but I can see the value in it for a great many people. I think over the last 10 or 15 years, we've had an explosion of mindfulness training and mindfulness meditation, as though this will be a panacea to all our problems. And I think that's not going to be true, right? And particularly when you focus on boredom, people who are boredom prone struggle to focus attention. There's a strong correlation between boredom proneness and ADHD. But even if you don't have ADHD symptoms, if you're boredom prone, it's hard to focus on a task at hand. It's hard to sustain your attention on a task at hand. And what is the thing that you need to do most if you need to get good at meditation? Focus your attention and sustain your attention, right? So I think asking people who are boredom prone to do meditation is sort of setting them up for failure. Because the other thing to think about this is that to be good at meditation and to get the full benefits out of meditation, you need practice. You need to do it for years. It's not like a musical instrument. It's something that you need to practice and do often to get really good at. It's not a thing that you can just dip your toe into and hope that somehow, it'll cure your ills of whether it's boredom or other sorts of things. So I'm not going to come down one side or the other that you should spend more time on your inner life and your inner tranquility or more time on your outer life. I do think that agency is critical. So whether or not, if you're the one that's choosing to meditate or you're the one that's choosing to pursue acquisitive goals, that's great. That's because you're choosing it and you're promoting your own agency. I also think connection is probably the most critical human need, so there's been some studies over the last little while about loneliness in the elderly. There's sort of a minister of loneliness affairs in the UK Parliament that is addressing it because it became a serious issue, particularly among their elderly. Loneliness is associated with boredom and associated with depression and all kinds of things. So I think the life that we want to promote most is one where we connect with each other effectively. And I think when you have those connections, those personal social connections of varied types, right? Can't be all of the same type, that you're probably not going to be bored that much, right? Because you have people to engage with. If I was to choose a path, that would be the one.
Which group happens to be the most influential in research when it comes to boredom? You mentioned teenagers, but I was just curious if there was certain, I don't know, like ADHD. I have ADHD. I get bored pretty easily. I just feel like we would be the perfect specimens to study when it comes to, like, I don't know, anything that happens to relate to boredom or mind wandering or anything of a capacity where you can't sit there and focus onto a certain task. Especially because I don't know, like I think obviously with little kids, I think they're probably not. I mean, people can say they get easily bored, but they get over it so quick. It doesn't last that long for them. It's like a couple of seconds and they're on to something else. But then you have elderly people too. Somehow I mean, besides being a little bit lonely, there's a large capacity of them that, in my opinion, don't experience boredom like how normal people experience boredom. A lot of them sit and read a book, or they do something, or they revel in the silence.
Hmm. Well, so we do know a little bit about boredom across the lifespan. It does tend to rise during the early teenage years. It hits a peak around 17 or 18 years of age and then starts to drop off. This is boredom proneness. That age range is really critical because at that 17, 18-year-old range, you're starting to have the last stages of brain maturity come on board, right? Brain development. Brain's not fully developed until you're about 22, 23. And so with that late stage development of your brain, you're also getting capacities for self-control that are important for keeping boredom at bay. So then boredom drops off during your 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. It never disappears. There's an interesting study from Chin and colleagues a couple of years back showing that boredom was one of the most prominent negative emotions throughout the age range of a really large sample that they had. And then towards the sort of 60s and 70s, it starts to rise again. It doesn't rise up to the levels that you see in teenagers, but it does rise up again. And probably due to changes in social networks and changes in loneliness and that kind of thing. So there's no, and then you ask about ADHD. I mean, there's two things that as a researcher that you might focus on there is, am I going to test people with ADHD to try and understand something about boredom, or am I going to test boredom in ADHD people to understand something about ADHD? And they're two very different ways of focusing your research. And both things happen. Both things are undergoing. There was an interesting study in children with ADHD where they took them on and off their medications for 2 weeks at a time. And when they were off medications, all of their ADHD symptoms rise, which is to be expected, but so did their boredom, right? So, and both things sort of rose and fell in lockstep with changes to medication regimes. Again, boredom is not a cause of ADHD, so we don't really know what to make of that relationship, other than it's another symptom and another thing to want to try and help them deal with. So there's not really I think because boredom is pretty well distributed throughout the entire population, most people have experienced it at some point in their lives, and most people continue to experience it at some level of frequency. There's no real single group that we focus on. There's also work from a guy called McWelling-Todman that looks at boredom in psychiatric populations, where it's also prominent in people with schizophrenia, for example. And again, we're trying to understand a symptom for that group to try and help that group cope better. We're not really trying to use that group to understand boredom per se. So there's lots of different work in lots of different populations, but no one sort of stands out as the critical population to study to understand boredom.
Are humans the only ones that have the capacity for boredom? I mean, I can't really tell if my dog is bored, but when she's sitting there for a minute and then randomly picks up a toy and keeps dropping it in front of you, I go, "You're definitely bored. You want to do something. You got energy to burn."
Yeah. Yeah, so there's those examples, and there's the other ones that are classic of dogs. If you leave your dog alone for too long, you'll come home to a destroyed shoe or a ripped up couch or something like that if you haven't trained the dog out well. So absolutely, the answer is yes. And I told you the story about the mice who will, administer an aversive stimulus in a boring room. There's a great study with mink that shows that if you house mink in a really boring environment for 2 weeks, that when you then let them out of that environment, they sort of go to any kind of stimulus without concern, right? So they'll approach things they would normally avoid. They'll approach things that they normally wouldn't care one way or another about. And so that's an evidence that the animal is bored and they just need something new, something interesting to look at, to engage with, to do something with. And so, yeah, I think there is evidence that other animals, other species get bored. And again, it comes back to this notion that they have free resources, available resources in their brain that they're not using right now. And so they'll engage in these behaviors that to us might look destructive, like, ripping up your shoe if you leave your dog alone. But really what they're doing is they're just coping with their boredom.
You mentioned searching for stimulus, which seems like to be a core trait across things that experience boredom, but does boredom come in various forms when it comes to looking at examples of like how you were going to measure it? Like sitting in a room, we can all think of the bland gray kind of, that's the boredom that we all know, that image. But then if you examine like and how an animal experiences boredom, fish just sit in a tank like their whole lives. Like that's boredom for me, but for them it seems like they're having a great time. So I'm curious if there's ways to be able to measure it by examining either other species or just other people and trying to see if it comes in varying forms.
So I don't think boredom comes in varying forms as a start. I think the boredom is a singular thing. It's a signal, as I mentioned before, that we consider it a self-regulatory signal. It pops up when you need it to and isn't there when you don't need it. And it just tells you you need to engage with something more meaningful. The fish example can bring me back to the octopus. If you compare the body plan, the body structure of the octopus to your average goldfish, the octopus is much more complex. So if I'm right about this neural surplus or this cognitive surplus idea and homeostasis that we talked about earlier, then boredom should only be evident to the extent that the animal has free resources, right? So a fish might not have a very complex or sophisticated central nervous system. Their body plan is not as complicated, certainly, as an octopus, and maybe even not as complicated as a human's. And so they might just not have a lot of free neural resources to dedicate to other things. They just need to swim, eat, shit, and away they go. And so they don't, there's nothing really much else that they need to dedicate their brain systems to. And so they don't have sophisticated brain systems and nervous systems. And so they don't have leftover resources in order to get bored. So the other answer there is absolutely we could study this in other animals and try and understand how it functions. And there is a little bit of work doing that, but we need to probably do more.
What about the philosophical meaning of boredom? Obviously, you mentioned in your first episode that it kind of elevates that everything around us is kind of meaningless when you really kind of sit there and examine what boredom does to us. But when it comes to, I guess, the overall meaning or the implications it has, I mean, it has a lot more deeper meaning than just, oh, it's just you're bored. It's kind of like a way of kind of, I don't know, keeping you aware of certain things and aspects of your life. I think it's a great time to account of all the things that you could be doing or things that you would like to be doing and maybe looking deeper into oneself. I mean, a lot of times, it took me 30 minutes of being bored until I went out and started cleaning out my car, which had to be done. It was sitting there for a long time. So there's a lot, obviously, there's a kind of a hidden message that comes with boredom.
Yeah, so I'm not a philosopher, and I have only sort of cursory knowledge of a lot of other philosophical treatises. The ones that are most relevant to boredom are existentialist philosophers that suggest that um, that boredom does highlight the sort of essential meaninglessness of life and the absurdity of life, and that potentially that our response to that should be not to rail against it, but to uh, find ways to just embrace that absurdity and live your life in purposeful ways regardless of it, right? Bertrand Russell too talks about the fact that the key to happiness is to again not fight against boredom, but accept that boredom, as opposed to sort of striving for a constantly stimulating experience. And so we used this word earlier about stimulation, but I meant in that instance sensory stimulation or sensory input. He's meaning, seeking things that are exciting and thrilling. And in a sort of a way akin to the Buddhists, that if you have that search in your life of I want things to always be exciting, then you're going to be on a never-ending treadmill. Once one exciting thing is done, you're going to need to either up your game, and you could then, cast this in an addiction model. The last thing that was exciting, well, that's good, but I can't repeat it. I've got to do something more exciting, and then more exciting again and again, and then now you're in that sort of thrill-seeking mode that you talked about earlier. And there is some sense that kind of behavior does look very much addiction-like. So boredom might be sort of exposing to you your own ordinariness. But, where there's 8 billion of us on the planet, we can't all even aspire to the 15 minutes of fame that Warhol might have said we could have. Our lives are pretty ordinary, and in some sense that ordinary might be perceived by others as boring, but we probably need to embrace it as the life that we choose and the life that we engage in, and that we choose what's meaningful. So things, I think we bandy this term of meaning around a lot. And as you mentioned, we know a lot about the fact that when people are bored, they find the situation meaningless, and they might even find their own lives to be meaningless or lacking in meaning. But when we talk about that, then I think there's a tendency to say that meaning has to also be grand, right? Like, what are you doing now? Well, I'm on the path to curing cancer. Oh, that's very meaningful, right? But we're not all on that path, and we can't all be on that path. So meaning can come from big things and small things, right? I find it not boring at all to go out and weed my garden. And it's like a monotonous thing. It's not really challenging intellectually, but at the end of it, the garden looks nicer, and I appreciate that, and I like that. So it matters to me. It's meaningful to me, but it's kind of trivial in the grand scope of the world, right? So when we're searching for meaning, so for me, I guess if you're asking about a philosophical sort of take, I think boredom can expose to you not merely your own ordinariness, but that within that ordinariness are goals that still can matter. that you can still find things that are worth doing for you.
What about when it comes to the boredom window? Obviously, how long until, if you're searching for stimulus, how long until that stimulus ends up being negative when someone will be more than happy to take the negative stimulus compared to a more positive one? Because if you're sitting with just being bored and you're trying to think of ways to overcome it, eating really good food is a good example. I mean, you can say it can end up being a negative depending on how much you have, but most of the time you're picking options of like, I want to do this stuff that's going to inspire fun, something that's going to be engaging. But how long can you sit in boredom until you're searching for any type of stimulus, and one of those stimulus being just negative, just because you want to get out of the feeling of being bored?
Yeah, so I think a lot of those things that we do that are negative in response to boredom are palliative, right? Whether it's drugs, alcohol, gambling, social media, they're quick reactions that we can take to being bored that alleviate the boredom feeling. And so we're doing them as palliative actions. Um, how long is a really difficult question to answer. What you're asking for is naturalistic experiments where I sort of follow people in the wild and ask them, how long have you been bored before you did this action A or action B? And we just don't have the capacity to do that kind of study. What I can tell you is that it doesn't take long in the lab to make you bored. Like I can take a minute and a half, right? So
What? Wait,
um,
no,
we
wait. Just a minute and a half.
yeah, I mean, probably even shorter. So there's lots of different ways. So Wynand van Tilburg makes people bored by having them copy out references to studies of concrete. Sandy Mann had people copy out phone numbers from a phone book, which, to kids nowadays, they go, what's a phone book, right? But she had them copy out that. What we do is we make people watch a video of two guys hanging laundry. And you don't have to watch that movie for very long before you're really, really bored. It takes about a minute and a half, and we make you watch it for four. So at the end of 4 minutes, you're quite bored. Now, I mean, the other timing question that I could say there is like the effects of that. So how long that boredom impacts you and lasts in the lab are quite short-lived, right? So if I make you bored after 4 minutes of watching my video, um, depending on what I get you to do next, that boredom could dissipate fairly quickly. So, but again, these are all lab studies, so I don't really know. I don't have a good answer for you of how long does it take before someone engages a suboptimal or maladaptive response when they're bored. I don't really know.
How did you find out that a video of two guys hanging laundry gets people bored?
Well, we piloted it, so we did the study. So what we wanted was we wanted to compare boredom to sadness, and one of the ways in which people had made sadness happen is they get people to watch a clip from a 1970s movie called The Champ, where a young kid is at the deathbed of his father, and he's dying from some boxing injury or something like that. So it's a 2 minute clip, 2.5 minute clip. It reliably makes people tear up and they get sad. And so what we wanted then is like, okay, well, now we need something equivalent that's going to make people bored. So we needed a video, that has some action in it, some movement, some talking. So the guys ask each other for a peg every once in a while. It had to have humans in it because the Champ clip for sadness had humans in it. And it had to have some movement in it, right? So that we were comparing apples to apples, as opposed to, if you did some other kind of task like writing out phone numbers from the phone book, that's a very different task than watching a movie. So we wanted an equivalent way to make people bored. And so we just tested it. We had various different lengths of our laundry video, and just in various groups of people asked them to say how bored they were at the end of that. And it turns out that they were very bored.
You reverse Karate Kid them. If you think about with all the chores he's doing, instead of, accomplishing a karate skill from all that, it's just no people hanging laundry. That's great. That's fantastic. Obviously, when it comes to boredom, there's many factors like the ones we've mentioned. There's a lot of probably other areas that we haven't talked about. But is there one for you that you would recommend people looking into when it comes into understanding boredom a little bit deeper?
Looking into in terms of their own responses to boredom.
Or just understanding of it. Obviously, I think understanding comes, I mean, I would probably talk about we need a better education on our emotions in general, or how to regulate them, at least a guide. I mean, we have a lot of understanding and research to it. Everyone's different, obviously, but just understanding that it's okay to, I think we do that now. It's okay to not be okay. But also with boredom, it's okay to not have something going on. Like, we don't need to do that 24/7, and we can spend time either by ourselves alone or, enjoy that capacity of it. It doesn't need to be a fearful thing.
Yeah. Well, I 100% agree. It doesn't need to be something that we're afraid of and that we're agitated by. And so this starts to drift into the self-helpy kind of stuff, which we don't have data on. But I would suggest it is good to try and recognize the signs that you're bored. So for me, if I'm in the home and I'm bored, typically that'll show itself up as pacing. Like I'll start pacing around the room, and looking for something but not finding it. So if I can recognize that sign that I'm bored, well, then you can take the next step, and that is, stop pacing, stop what you're doing that is the signal that you're bored, and do something else. And it could either be do something else or do nothing. And I think boredom does give you an opportunity to reflect a little bit on what your life goals are. And again, I want to be careful to say life goals, big and small. You don't have to, cure cancer every time you get bored. You don't have to, reach that sort of career goal every time you get bored. You can just think about them and think, well, am I pursuing those things that I think are meaningful to me in the most effective way I could, whether or not it's right now in the moment or thinking more about sort of longer term projections. And boredom does give you the chance to do that, to just reflect a little bit. And perhaps if you do that calm reflection on what matters most to you and reflecting a little bit on your own agency, like am I making the choices that are really working towards those goals or not? Then I think boredom can be working for you as opposed to just making you agitated, right? It can be doing something positive for you.
And is there a place where people can find your publications and any other research where your lab is located?
Yeah, so my website is just my name, jamesdanckert.com, and they can go there. There's fairly easy to find news articles that people have written about boredom that I've been a part of. There's also a couple of highlighted research papers that they can connect to. And then, of course, if you just put my name in Google Scholar, you'll find everything that I've ever written about boredom. And the problem, I guess, for your listeners is that some of that will be behind paywalls, but we try as much as we can to make most of our work now open access. So hopefully most of it's freely available to people.
And I appreciate the time you gave me to do my show. I appreciate the work that you do. And I'll make sure to link all your links in the description below for people to be able to click. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.